All right, you guys, the last chapter in our textbook. Oh, that's a little big, which is super exciting. So, chapter 5 has to do with civil rights and public policy. So, this is going to be a short video on just the introduction, pages 138 to 140. And in that introduction, it does talk about Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. And then, of course, following that, we will have the civil rights movement. Keep in mind that the civil rights movement is going to start with the double victory campaign African Americans fought in World War II. So, victory at home over racism and victory abroad over the Nazis. And when a lot of those soldiers return back to America, they do realize how unfair the situation is in a segregated America. And even though this is primarily in the South because of legal and customary means, de jure and de facto segregation. There is segregation across the country. And while we do tend to focus in our American history, AP American history, all of our history courses at the high school level, we do tend to focus on civil rights concerning African Americans. I just want to remind you that other groups are going to struggle with gaining individual rights as well. The big reason we do focus on the civil rights movement for African Americans is in part because I think of the ties, of course, to slavery and the need to really kind of clarify the struggle following slavery for African Americans. And then also because, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. was such an important leader with his nonviolent resistant methods that were then those tactics were then, I don't want to say copied because they weren't his originally. He borrowed them from Gandhi as well. But Cesar Chavez used those tactics as well here in California. And then other groups also had to fight for civil rights and civil liberties and uh, just to have equality, and it's still a struggle that is still occurring. So in your book it's going to talk about Rosa Parks, and of course she's very important. She's a key member to the civil rights movement. When I teach civil rights movement in American history, I like to really focus on that word movement. Sometimes people just kind of assume or are incorrect and just not, or maybe just don't even consider it, but just think like these things happen. Like a lot of times that myth, Rosa Parks, oh, she was just tired, she didn't feel like moving to the back of the seat, the back of the bus. So that's not true. A movement is what we call it because this was a planned out um, I want to say movement, which is not the word I'm looking for, but it was carefully orchestrated, linking events, building on one thing after the other. And I do feel like many people get that wrong just because they do. But I do feel like many people get that wrong because of inherent racism we have, where we don't want to recognize the leaders as being really smart, really brave, and just really finding ways to go against the oppression that they faced. So I really like to make a point. We call it a movement because number one, it was a movement. And number two, it's important that we recognize these things didn't just happen. That these people, our civil rights leaders, were important, trained, practiced, intelligent, educated, and they displayed leadership, they displayed discipline, patience, and they worked very, very hard, right? Very hard, and they suffered. And so we always want to refer to it as a movement and recognize those people. I think that's a little bit get off my block, but but I definitely like for that to be recognized. So just from the introduction, these pages, in addition to Rosa Parks, and again, this is Gov, so we're going to focus more on policy. But civil rights, they're policies that extend basic rights to groups historically subject to discrimination. So again, we're gonna talk about many groups, including racial discrimination, gender discrimination, discrimination based on age, disability, sexual orientation, and then even some other factors will come up as well. So it's a very broad topic. There's a lot in it, and of course, with Gov, there's going to be a lot of legislation and Supreme Court cases that are going to be a part of this movement as well. Okay, I'm going to stop there for this one.